Net zero is a scam. Well, sort of. We do need to transition from a fossil fuel based society to a renewable energy based society. But the actions and plans that are currently taking place in order to achieve this is very, very unrealistic. And to understand why, I feel like a good place to start would be what actually is net zero? Well, net zero by the definition of the United Nations is cutting carbon emissions to a small amount of residual emissions that can be absorbed and durably stored by nature and other carbon dioxide removal measures, leaving zero in the atmosphere. What that essentially means is that a country should have no emissions, no greenhouse gases being emitted from that country. So that doesn't just include carbon dioxide, but that includes methane, that includes fluoride, fluorinated gases, and also nitrous oxide. Now, this is what actually birthed the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement was a treaty that was signed by 197 countries in 2015, all agreeing that by 2050 there will be net zero. Now, this sounds nice and it sounds great, but is it actually realistic? No. Why is that? Well, let's look at this data from 1973, which shows the energy mix at that specific period of time. And as we can see, fossil fuels contributed towards approximately 87% of their energy. Now, if we compare that to data from 2023, we can see that fossil fuels contributed about 82%. So that means over literally in 50 years that we've only gone down by 5%. And they expect in 25 years, by 2050, that we are going to be absolutely ridden of fossil fuel. It's absolutely ridiculous, because you're telling me we're just going to get completely rid of this 82% of our energy production and replace it with renewable energy, even though to be able to make these solar panels and make these wind turbines, you need fossil fuels. Like, in order to make the plastic, you need oil. In order to actually put these materials together requires energy, which again is provided from these fossil fuels. Now, another thing that we need to think about is infrastructure. Now, I think a lot of people are seeing that they're starting to use more, solar panels and wind turbines. But is the grid actually ready for the introduction of all these different types of energy sources, these new energy sources? And the simple answer to that is no. Why is that? Well, the grid wasn't built for them. They're built for traditional power plants such as coal and gas, which have gas turbines, which produce something called inertia. Now, to be able to understand what inertia is, let's think about a bike. Now, on the bike, you are pedaling, and let's imagine that you stop. But as you stop pedaling, your bike is still moving forward, even though you're not necessarily putting any more energy in. That is inertia. And that inertia, when you're cycling, allows you to maybe swerve, catch a breath, or whatever. And if this same inertia in the grid is used to help people react to if there's a drop in electricity from one energy source, such as maybe a coal plant, and then it would allow for another energy source to be introduced to the grid to allow it to stabilize. But the issue with renewables such as solar and wind is that they don't have these turbines, they have inverters which don't create any inertia, which means that there is less time to be able to react if there is a drop in frequency, meaning that the likelihood of a blackout significantly increases. Another reason why the grid isn't ready is to do with actually battery storage. Now, the issue with solar and wind is that, yes, they may be able to provide energy for a period of time, but the sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing. So when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, it creates this massive energy gap, which is what the battery storage is there for. But the battery storage, at least now, don't have the capabilities to be able to store enough energy, which then means that the grid then relies on going back into these fossil fuels, which then again goes to my original point why it's a bit ridiculous to say that to get rid of these fossil fuels just completely, even though we rely on them in situations like this. And one more thing that we need to think about with infrastructure is that the grid wasn't actually built for a two-way system. What do I mean by that? Well, at least when it comes to solar roof panels, when there's too much energy and they can't store it, they just give it back to the grid. But the grid originally was built in a way so that it comes from an energy source, goes through the transmission lines, and then it's delivered to your homes. But putting back electricity back into the grid now causes serious issues such as voltage instability and sometimes even damaging of equipment if not regulated properly. Now, another concept that I want you guys to think about is how consistent and reliable are these renewable energy sources? And I'll tell you right now, not that much. As I went over before, the wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining, which creates a massive energy gap. And this is what and to be able to understand this, we must look into capacity factor. Now, what is capacity factor? Capacity factor essentially tells us how often a power plant is actually producing electricity compared to how much it could produce 24/7 all year round. Now, if we actually look at real data, we can see here, nuclear being 2 to 3 times more reliable than wind and so much as 4 times more reliable than solar, which goes to show you that relying on solely solar and wind could be absolutely catastrophic to be able to provide in reliable energy that we use day to day. And one other concept that we need to think about is carbon offsets. Now, carbon offsets are a way for companies to be able to reduce their emissions without actually stop emitting the pollutants from their company. So they may do this through 2 types of projects, either prevention or removing. So with prevention, that would include just investing in projects such as solar panels and wind turbines, or it would include them investing into, or removing would involve just planting trees, which would then extract the carbon from the environment. Now, the reason why this doesn't actually work at all is due to 4 reasons. And these 4 reasons are permanence, additionality, leakage, and verification. Now, permanence refers to planting trees not just to last a couple of years, but hundreds. But what we actually often see is that these trees are planted and never end up actually living up to 100 years, which was intended. For example, we can see this in California, where big companies such as BP and Delta Airlines all invested in a project where trees were going to be built, were going to be planted. But the issue, what ended up happening is that in 2020 to 2021, only about a couple years into the project, is that there was a massive wildfire which caused all those carbons that they were meant to offset to go right back into the environment, which is a clear example which shows that it doesn't work. Now, additionality. Additionality refers to fully funding a project that reduces emissions. So, for example, let's say you have, I don't know, but again, we can see that this never ends up working out. This can be seen in India and China, when in the 2000s they were approved by the United Nations to be able to approve carbon credits. So what happened is that a lot of big companies started buying these carbon credits. But what ended up, when people started doing research into it, they found that these projects were going to happen anyways, and they didn't need funding at all. So again, it goes to show us like it doesn't actually end up solving any issues or offsetting any carbons that these companies have. The third one is leakage. Now, leakage refers to making sure that your project doesn't just shift your problem somewhere else. What I mean by this is that, for example, if you're trying to say that, okay, don't cut these trees to reduce deforestation, but then by you saying don't cut trees here, they just end up cutting trees maybe a couple of miles away. And again, we can see that leakage always ends up occurring. Why? Because even though you may say this area is banned, they'll just end up finding another area. This can be clearly seen in Brazil, where a lot of the times people want to stop the deforestation, but they'd end up finding areas which are very far away to be able to cut down. Now, the last one I want to mention is verification. Now, verification refers to ensuring that a project is actually happening. So let's say all three of these reasons that I mentioned before, permanence, additionality, and leakage, that there was no leakage, all actually occurred positively and there was no negatives behind it. But that's only because it seems that way. Verification ensures that all three of these things have actually happened. But again, as we can see, that most projects that actually occur, we can see that 90% of them never end up actually occurring. And overall, this shows that carbon offsets themselves is just a massive scam in itself, a massive industry, in fact, worth about $1 trillion. And it's definitely not the solution towards the main issue we're having from shifting from a fossil fuel based society to renewable energy based society. Now, what is the solution? The solution is to have not a one size fits all. So for example, not just having a fully renewable energy based society, at least for now, but to have a combination between them. For example, I feel like we should stop burning fossil fuels just for everything, but more focusing on things that are more heavy intensive, such as aviation or heavy industries. Nuclear would be there if we need it for reliable and consistent energy, not just something that's only about 5% or 2% of our energy mix. We need it maybe up to about 20%. Now, renewables should be introduced to places where it makes sense. You should have solar panels in places that are sunny, maybe the Caribbean, some places in Africa, places like Florida. But no, you should not be having bloody solar panels in the UK where it's literally sunny for about 2-3 months and that's it. And wind turbines should be there for when it makes sense. Again, in the UK, it's been quite windy, so then you introduce wind turbines in those areas. But yes, this is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you learned something from this. Maybe start asking some questions. And if you have anything to debate on, or maybe something you don't agree with, hit in the comments below. I'm always open for a debate. But yeah, my name is Dominic Pollard Odell, and this channel is to do with everything and anything to do with energy. I post weekly, so stay tuned for next week, and peace out.